In this section, we're covering the Google Apps Script calendar service. So interacting with the Calendar App class. And this service allows you to access, modify the user's Google Calendar, including additional calendars and creating calendars, and also calendars that the user has subscribed to. It allows the script to read, update the user's Google Calendar. Also, this class provides direct access to the user's default calendar, as well as the ability to retrieve additional calendar and get all of the information contained within the calendars. So the Calendar app and also the location, how we can get events and set up events within the calendar. Also setting full day events, series events, and also specific start and end times within the event. Selecting calendars, how we can create a new calendar and how we can specify certain calendars. Deleting calendars as well. Updating calendars, adding the name, updating the calendar name, updating the calendar description, updating the color, the description, and how it is represented within the Google Calendar. We've got a few projects as well, so coding challenge projects, where we're going to be listing out the events that are contained within a calendar from a start and an end point, and listing that information into a spreadsheet. Also, how you can create a guest on the calendar, adding guests into the calendar and calendar events, how we can update and get those guests and that guest information, how we can also remove guests from a calendar event, how we can set up a reoccurrence on a calendar event as well. And overall, all of the amazing things that you can do with the calendar service, and then connecting it to the other Google suite of services together to provide even more advanced functionality. So let's get started. In this section, we're going to be looking at the Calendar app. So Calendar app and using the calendar service within the Google Apps script. So let's go ahead and create a brand new standalone script. So under the Drive More Apps script, we're going to open up the script editor. And this is where we can create a brand new script, and we'll just give it a name, call it Calendar App. And I'll call it Calendar App Tester. So just give it a name, Calendar App Tester. So that's our new project that we've created. So we want to get the calendars using the Calendar app. And with Google, within your Google account, you have an opportunity to create other additional calendars. So I do have a few calendars that are available within my calendar, and we'll just try to get all of the calendars and loop through the different calendar options that we have. So let's start by creating the function. I'll make the code on the left-hand side a little bit smaller, the file list, and creating a function. And we'll call it get my calendars. So it's the function that we're going to loop through, and we're going to get all of the calendars. So using the Calendar app class, we've got a number of options here that we can create events. We can create a calendar as well. We can get all of the calendars, get all of the owned calendars. So there's a number of options. We can also get calendar by ID, get calendars by names. So we want to retrieve back the calendar object, and every account, every Google account will always have a get default calendar, so it'll always have a default calendar as well. So what we'll do is we'll just select and get all of the calendars that we have available. And then within the logger log, we'll log out the details of cals, and we'll see what gets returned there. So this is going to be an array of objects and multiple items there that are going to be available within the calendars that we're going to be able to loop through and get the details of each one of the calendars. So just as the other apps, we need to make a selection of what object that we want to make use of. So we need to also accept the permissions. So go ahead and accept the permissions for the app to run and access the user's default calendar. So these are the this is the permissions that we're asking for the Google app to be able to access the calendar service. So once we've applied the authorization, we loop through and we see that this particular user has 6 different calendars. So this is an array object of calendar objects, and that also corresponds with the calendars that I have. And if we want to get the names of the calendars, we can log that information out. So let's get the cals object and looping through. So looping through each one of the calendars, returning it back as a calendar within the for each loop array. And now we can output the calendar. And I'm actually going to just update this and call it mycal to avoid any confusion with using the word calendar. So let's select the calendar object, and each one of these calendars, they're going to have a length and as well as a name. And so just get the my name value, and we can get that from getting the mycal object. And within the calendar itself, we have option to create day events, create day series, create events. We can also delete the calendar, so we can delete the calendar entirely. We can get color of the calendar, description, so that's all available. And the one that we want to do is get the name of the calendar. So we want to, as we're looping through each one of the calendars, we want to return back the name of the calendar that we're looking at. And it should return back all 6. I'll comment out the logger log for cals, and we'll run the code one more time. And this time we should be able to see all of the names of the calendars. So this is where we start the execution. So we've got this one calendar, we've got another calendar, which is our default calendar, another one called test, we've got updated name, learning, and birthdays. So those are the 6 calendars that we have. We can also get things like the ID of the calendar. So let me turn this actually into an object, and that will give us more flexibility into what we can return back. So we can add additional object values there. So if we have a name, we just get the name, and let's get a few other items that we're going to log out to retrieve back from the my calendar object. Let's also get the ID of the calendar. We can also get the color of the calendar. So if there's a particular color that's been set for the calendar, let's get the calendar, and we can set a color as well from here. So that will allow you to distinguish it visually within your calendar interface. And we'll also get from the mycal, we can get things like the description, the events. So we want to get the events, and this is going to be an object of all of the events that are within the calendar. So within the events as well, we can specify information. So if we want to get the events for the day, this will return back any events that we have within the current day. And it does require some parameters. And one of the parameters is that it does require the date object. So you need to specify the current date, get the calendar object, and then you can get the events for the day. So this is using the JavaScript date object, and we can also log out the number of events. So let's grab the date object and select that and create that as an object. And we'll just call it today. And we'll do a new date. So it's going to return back the current date value for the object. So we want to return back the calendar for today. And actually need to comma separate that out because that's within the object. And with the value, we can also return back length. So if we wanted to get the count of events, we can get the events and then get a length value for all of the events. And for the get events, we need to specify a start and an end time. So we're just going to do that where we're getting the today object, and then we'll just return back the length of that. So we'll have a count for how many items that we've got within the calendar. And of course, because it's within the object, we can always pick that up after. So how about we even remove this out, and we're going to log it separately within the log. And I don't actually have any events scheduled yet. So within the my name, we're going to get the val, and then val is going to have a length value that we're going to look at and see, and that's going to be equivalent to the mycal get events today length, so that we don't have to call the object twice for all of the events that we currently have today. And let's go over to the calendar and add in a day, and we'll just call it hello world and save the event. And let's run the script and see what we get back within the object, the calendar object. So it's selecting the calendar, it's providing us the color, the values, the ID of the calendar, the name of the calendar. So all of that information is being returned back. And then we're also tracking how many events for today are in that calendar. And we only have events within the default calendar. So that's the one with the ID of the email address and also the name of the email address. And for the events, it returns back a calendar event object. And then this calendar event object is going to have a list of all of the events. So when you see it within an array format, that means that we're returning back an object that we could iterate through, and we could return back each calendar event. And if we want to get a count for them, we can always use the length in order to return back a count for all the values that are contained within that array. So go ahead and try it out, select your calendar, and I'll show you some more neat things that you can do, such as making new calendars and also deleting calendars, adding colors, and a whole bunch of really cool things that you can do with the Calendar app. In the last lesson, we saw how we can get all of the calendars that we've got currently available to us. So sometimes the calendars get shared, so you don't necessarily own the calendars. And there's different functions to get the calendars, and you can also get calendars by name. So let's try out and get some calendars. So just do a short form for calendars, and we'll create some functions to get the calendars. So cals1, and using the CalendarApp class, the calendars that we can get. So we can get calendars, get owned calendars by name, and we can also get owned calendars by ID. And we can also get all of the calendars and all of the owned calendars. So we'll return back all of the owned calendars, and then we'll search for calendars by a specific name. So let's loop through the list of calendars and use for each. And I'll just return it back, the object as cal. And then within the logger log, we'll log out. We'll get the cal and then use get name, and we'll return back the name of the calendar. And actually that should be cals, so it's plural. So it's going to return back all of the owned calendars. So we'll get some of the calendars that we have available to us. So we've got the 5 owned calendars. So that was different than all of the calendars that we had. So if we go back to what we did last time, where we were just getting all of the calendars. So we can see not all of the calendars are owned by us. And let's output those, and this time we'll get the IDs of those calendars. So we should return back 6 calendars there within the first iteration. So those are the IDs of the calendars. And then the second group has the 5 that are owned by us. So 5 owned calendars. And there's also some options as well where we can get the calendars by ID and also get calendars by name. So let's create another loop, and I'm gonna, just to save some time, I'll copy the one that we just made earlier, and instead of get all owned calendars, let's get calendars by, or get calendars by name. So let's go produce a plural, and then afterwards we'll get the calendar by ID. So we'll get calendars by name, and we need to add in a parameter, so it's expecting a string parameter. So if we want to get the calendars that are matching the name of whatever the name is that we're looking for, and in this case we'll look for calendars that have test in the name. So the string value that we're going to be returning back are test, and then we'll just loop through all of those calendars. And to distinguish between the two in the logger, and then afterwards we'll grab an ID and then we'll select the calendar by ID. So it's going to return back only the one calendar object. And here we're looping through all of the calendar objects. So the ones by name, it found the 2 that had the name test. So those got returned there. And then we've got the 5 that we owned, and so on. So let's do the last one where we want to get the calendar by ID. So this is just going to only return back the singular calendar. And for calendar IDs, you have for every calendar, they're going to have a unique ID. So if you want to get your calendar's ID, you can get the default calendar. and then you can get the ID of the calendar. And this will return back the ID. So the calendar ID, and then we can use that calendar ID. And I know we've already selected the default calendar object, but just to illustrate that we can then use the ID, and we can select the calendar by ID, and it's only going to return back the one calendar object, and that's going to be the default calendar because that's the one that we're using for the ID. So let's do that, and then lastly we'll just return it back by ID. So that's how you can select a specific calendar, and if it's the default calendar that you're after, then you can just use the get default calendar method. So let's run that one more time, and we'll check the ID in the end, and the ID of the default calendar is just going to be your email address. So if you're ever in doubt, you can always go over to the calendar. You can get more details about the calendar, so settings and sharing, and then within the settings and sharing, if you go down, you can see that this is the email address, and then somewhere down here at the bottom it's got the calendar ID, and then you can use this calendar ID in order to access it with your app script. So each one of these calendars will have a different ID. So for this one, for instance, if I want to go get the ID, it's going to have quite a bit longer ID, and it's within the group. So if I want to return back a calendar object by its specific ID, so let's create a variable with the calendar ID that I just selected. So we're not going to be using the default one. We're going to use this one that I've just selected, and this is going to be cal1 since it's only returning back the one object. And using the calendar app, let's get the calendar by ID, and then it's expecting the parameter, which is the ID value. And then now within the log, we'll log out the name of cal1, and we'll just get the name value of the calendar, so using the getName method. So let's run that one more time. And again, we're not using the default one, we're just returning back whatever one that we just selected here, and the name of that one is test. So you have a number of different options in order to select the calendar object, and then once you've selected the calendar object, then you can begin to interact with the calendar, interact with the events, and so on. So the first thing to do, just like all of the other Google apps, is to make a selection of the object that you want to interact with, and then once you've made that selection and you've got it within your code, then you're ready to continue and create your interactions and manipulations of that object. In this lesson, we're going to create a brand new calendar, and then we're going to update the name of the calendar that we're just creating. So just call it make calendar, and then within this function, so first let's get our calendar object. So using the CalendarApp class, we can create a calendar. So this is just going to be creating a calendar, so a brand new calendar, and it does require a parameter. The parameter that it requires is a string name for the calendar. So you can give the calendar a name, and then we can update some of the values so we can get the name, we can get the ID of the calendar. So let's give it a name, and we'll just call it new calendar today. So this is going to create a brand new calendar in the listing of calendars. And then once we've created the calendar, let's log out the calendar by its ID, so get ID, and return back the ID of the calendar, and that should actually be uppercase. And also let's take the calendar object, and we're going to set a color for the calendar. So the color requires a string, so this is a hexadecimal value for the calendar color, so you can set whatever hex color value we want. And then as well for the color, let's set a description for the color, and or description for the calendar. This is a test calendar. So creating a test calendar, and then also for the calendar, let's set its name. So we've already created it as new calendar today, and we'll just call it updated name. So let's do all of that and run the make calendar. And we're creating the new calendar. So we got the calendar ID there, and that's going to be important. So I'm going to track that in, and we'll create another function to do something with that calendar ID. And you can also go over to your Google Calendar and go back to all of your calendars. And then here we've got the newly created calendar that we just created. So if we select the calendar, we can get the calendar information. So we've got some of the calendar settings here. And then if we go down, we get the calendar ID. So if we want to integrate the calendar, we can share that ID. And then there's also options to remove the calendar. And in addition to the calendar, so we've got some other options that are within the calendar itself. So let's go back to our calendars. And then here we've got the calendar. So we've got a color set for the calendar. And then if we want to select and get the settings and the sharing values, so that's all going to be, again, we can go through and we can get the different settings and sharing values of the calendar. So all of the information that we're able to set within the calendar app, it's also available within the calendar interface. So now that we've created a calendar, what we want to do is we've updated the name, we've set a description for the calendar, and then we can always retrieve this information back. So let's update the calendar. And within this function, so we're going to set an ID, so the ID value of the calendar, so that we can set it and interact with it and grab the calendar by its ID value. And then let's get the calendar object. So using the calendar app, and we can open or get calendar by ID. So that's up here at the top. So just use the same ID value for the calendar. And let's log out the calendar description so that we know that we already set a description. So let's do a get description of the calendar. So output the description, and also within the logger log, take the calendar object and let's get the color of the calendar. So that will output those two values that we set. Let's check out update calendar and run update calendar. So we've got the calendar description, the calendar color that we set up in the previous function where we were making the calendar. So we're able to get the calendar, and also we can create a description to the calendar. We can update the name of the calendars. And if we want to delete this calendar, so let's say we've finished and we've created a calendar, but we no longer want to use the calendar. So that's going to be the last function here where we're going to be selecting and deleting the calendar. So getting the calendar object, getting it by ID. And of course, here in the update, before we delete it, let's make some updates to it. So within the set, we can set the description, we can set it as hidden, we can set the color, we can even set the time zone for the calendar. So if we want to update the color, description, or any of these parameters, we can set that up at this point. So how about we just set it as hidden? And this requires a Boolean value. So if we go to true, that's going to set the calendar to hidden. So before we delete it, let's check to see the calendar. And this is the updated name calendar. So currently this calendar, and if we go into the share settings, and this is the ID of this current calendar. So we do have two because we did run the script twice. So it's actually going to be the other one that we're going to be deleting. So that's going to be this one here. And just going by the IDs. And so it is going to be this green one that we're going to be updating. So we did set it to be hidden. So let's go back to our general calendar. We're going to refresh it. And let's run one more time to update the calendar. And do a refresh for that. And so now that green calendar is hidden. So we've hidden the calendar. And if we want to unhide it, then we'll just set it to false. And what that's doing is that's hiding it from and showing it from the visible area. And we can also update. So once we have the calendar objects, we can update the color if we want to. And there's more information about the color reference here for the calendar app colors. So that's another option for colors that you can set within the calendar app. So you can use a numbered color. And if you specify a hex value that's not here, it's going to pick the closest one to the available hex. So let's say, for instance, we want to set it to this yellowish color. So let's grab the hex for the yellow color and set the color as that hex color and run. So right now that new calendar is going to show up. And if I refresh the calendar object, so that calendar is now showing up and we've updated the color value as well for it. So you do need to select from the available colors that they have within the calendar service and use the hex value in order to set the color value. So now that we've worked with the calendar, we're ready to delete the calendar. So we can set the calendar and then run the method to delete the calendar. And what this is going to do is this is going to delete the calendar. So what it does is deletes the calendar permanently. The user can only delete the calendar they own. So that means that you need to own the calendar that you are deleting. So let's run the function, delete the calendar. And now if we go out here, and if we try to access the calendar, it's not found. And that's because we're still seeing the cache version. When we refresh, it's gone. So that's how you can create a calendar. You can update some of the properties of the calendar. Also select those properties, update some of the additional properties of those, set it to hidden with a Boolean value, and then lastly, delete the calendar. This lesson, we're going to be looking at the events that are listed within the calendar object. So we need to select the calendar and get my events. So create a function name, and this is going to return back the event object. So first thing we want to do is select a calendar, and we're just going to use the default calendar from now on, just to make it easy. So get default calendar. It's going to return back the calendar class as an object. And let's just double check that we do have the default calendar. So get the name of the calendar, and then that should be the email address, because that's by default the default calendar. So let's make sure that we do have that. So we do have the name and the email. So that means that we're able to select the default calendar. And within the default calendar, we want to pull back the events that are located within the calendar. So let's go ahead and we're going to get the events. We're going to pull out all of the events. We can also pull out the events by day. So what we want to do here is we want to get the calendar event object. So let's go ahead and select the calendar events. And these are, as we saw before, they're going to return an array. And what it does require parameter. So it does require a start date and an end date for the calendar. So they do have a formula here that you can use the JavaScript today or the current date and then add to the current date. So let's set up a start and an end date and create those parameters for it. So the start date, and that's going to be today's date. And then for the end date, so we do need to have an end time. Let's create a new date object, and then we're going to be using the current time that's within the start and get it as time. So it's going to return it back as millisecond object. And I'll just comment this out for now, and I'll take a look at it. We'll go within the logger and I'll show you what we have for the start get time. So it's going to return back a value for the milliseconds. So let's run the get my events. So it returns back this value, and that's the current time within milliseconds. So when we turn it into a timestamp, that means that we can also make the calculation, how many milliseconds we want to add to it. So this is going to be a future date. And if we want to have a date within a week, let's do the multiplication. So 1000 milliseconds times 60 seconds times 60 minutes times 12 or 24 hours. So that's 1 day. And if we want to do it for the next week, then we multiply it by 7. And that's how you can get a value for the milliseconds. So now the start time is going to be the current date, and the end is going to be the time that's going to be returned back within the milliseconds of the argument. And actually, I just put it in the wrong spot. So this actually needs to go in. Instead of get time, we need to add that into the events. So that's going to return back the events object. And for the events objects, we can use a for each and loop through return back each individual event. And that's going to be the calendar event. And from the calendar events, then we can use that event object And for each event object, they have titles. So just grab it by the title. And actually that should be get title, not set title. And that's logged out into the log. So let's run the code and get the calendar event object. So there we've got the name of the event object. So now that we've got it as an event object, there's a number of opportunities there to update some of the properties. So we can as well set color of it. And let's go take a look and see what the set color is. And we can use the calendar app event colors. We can set a color from there. And if you do need to open that, you can always select that and click the color value. And these colors are being returned back as string numbers. So let's go ahead and try to set it as this valued for number 3. And then within the set color, we'll add in the string value argument for the color that we want to set it as. So let's go ahead and run the code. We're going to get the events. And within the calendar, once we run it, it now updated the color of the calendar to the color that we had preset here. And we can also, once we have the event object, there's any number of things. So we can set the time, we can set the title, we can set the visibility, as well as we can set up guests. So set it that guests can invite others, set guests can modify, set guests can see. And this is all contained within the event object. So when you are creating events within your Google Calendar, you have all of the guest permissions. So you can set this with script as well. And also let's get the ID value of this event and output that into the log. And then the next example, we can just grab it by the ID, and then we'll try to make some updates to that, and we'll run some code for that. So let's run through that, get my events. And that's the ID of the event, and this is a unique ID value for this event. So now let's update event. So we can go directly to get the event object. We don't have to loop through anymore. We can get the event object. So using the calendar app, we can get event by ID, and then this is where we can add the ID of the event. So let's out the string value of the ID of the event and add it in. So now we're getting the event object, and now let's make some updates to the event object. So let's set some properties, and let's set the guests can invite others and modify. Let me double check and see what isn't. So modify event isn't set. So let's allow the guests can modify. And this is going to be expecting a Boolean value. So you can set it to true. And usually with the Boolean values, they're indicated with the checkbox. So let's run the code and see what happens. And I'm not running the right function, so that was the problem there. So let's run that function, and I'll do a refresh on it. And so now that's checked off. So you can check and uncheck the guest permissions. So this is part of the guest permissions. Let's also see some of the other things that we can do to it. So we can set a color, we can set a description. And I'll just type in the new description there and run the update on it again. So the description is just down here. So when we refresh it, now we've got a description in the event. Let's try a few other ones. So we can set a time, we can set a location for this. And the location as well is just going to be a string value. And I'll just set it to my home. And that's going to update that location value within that input. So setting it to whatever we indicated as. And if you do have the event, you can also set your status for event. So setting the my status, and this is going to look for the guest status object. So that can be set, and that's using the calendar app calendar event set status, and then you can use the calendar app guest status value in order to set it. So use calendar app guest status. So that's right up at the top. So the enums are up at the top, and the same for visibility. It's up at the top, event color and colors. So all of that is up at the top. And then this will give you a drop down list of what status you want to set. So you can do invited, maybe, no, owner, yes. So let's set the status to no. And we'll run the code to update the event and take a look and see what we've got for the event. And I guess unless you're a guest, so actually we're setting the guest status. So that's not exactly correct because we're not doing the guest status. So that's the owner, and as an owner, we're not able to update our guest status. So that's why we failed on that one, but I can leave this in, and this is if you've been invited to an event that you can set up and set your status to. So there's also the set visibility, and this as well is calendar app. And right at the top, the visibility object. And for the visibility, so you can set the visibility to be public, private, default, confidential. So you can set the visibility of that calendar invite. So I'm going to set it to be public. And let's open that up. So the visibility is listed here in the drop down. We can see public, private, default visibility. There's also free and busy that you can set. And let's do one more that we'll set a tag, and the tag requires just a string value. So this can be a tag that you can use, and it's just a key or a value that you can use in order to tag back this event. So let's select it as test, and I do need also a value for it. So I'll just set it to true. So test and true, and actually this requires a string value. So the key is going to be test, the value is going to be yes for the tag. So let's add the tag to the event. And this allows us to store custom metadata within the calendar event. So in the next lesson, we're going to create an event. So let's come up next. In this lesson, we're going to be going back to the calendar app class and creating events using the calendar app class. So let's go ahead and we'll make events and create a function in order to make some events. Let's select our calendar object that we want to use. So using calendar app, and let's get the default calendar object. And then that way within the calendar app, from here we can create events. So there's a number of options for creating events. So we can create an event from a description. So that's actually a pretty quick one because all we have to do is enter in a description. So that will create an event. Test 1, and that's going to be our description. So we can just create an event just really simply with just this one description, and that's going to automatically generate an event with the description. And you can also add in some other parameters here. So if, for instance, this is going to be Monday at 4 p.m., we're going to add that into the description. So what this does is it creates an event from a free-form description. So when we add in information, it's going to read the information and make some assumptions of when this should be added in. So we've got a name, and then we've got a Monday at 4 p.m. So we're not very specific on this. And if you just do have a general kind of creating event with some words, with some text, you can try it out and see what happens and see where it generates it. So let's see what happens. So going in, and let's now look at the Monday. So what calendar events we have on our default calendar for Monday, and it actually generated on the previous Monday, so the past Monday instead of the upcoming Monday. So not really the best way or the most accurate way, but it does generally be able to generate events fairly seamlessly with the create event. And from here, if we wanted to make the event, we can also update it. But the best way to add the event is to be more specific, to have a start time, end time, and then provide all of the options where you are creating an event. So there's an option to create an all-day event as well. So let's get rid of this one. So that's just creating from a description and just using the description values in order to generate the event. So creating from the, let's create an all-day event. So create all-day event. So that's another fairly straightforward one where it expects to get a title, and then it also needs a date object. So when we're creating this, so let's create a date, and we'll use the JavaScript date object. So same thing that we did before, using the milliseconds, the timestamp milliseconds. So create a new date object. And if you just want to use today, you can just use today. And let's set it for a particular date, future dates, and creating another date object. And then within the date object, let's make the calculations for how far ahead we want to make this. So selecting the today and getting it as time, and then we're going to add to it a value. So this is milliseconds, and actually let's bracket it. So milliseconds and seconds and minutes, hours, and how many days ahead. So if we want to just do 1 day ahead, we can just do 24 hours ahead. And we're going to create this all day event, and we'll do it for tomorrow. So let's run and see what happens. So it's adding it in for tomorrow. So there's our title, and there's a day that's been added in. And if we want to set it, let's say 3 days ahead, we can multiply it by 3. So the last parameter there is going to be the days. And that should set it somewhere 3 days ahead, creating another event with the same title of title and setting it 3 days event. We can also get back the event object. And then for the event object, we can set the color, or we can set the description of it, set the title. So let's update and set a color. So it's expecting the calendar event colors object. So let's do it this way. We'll select out the calendar event object, colors, and let's set it to pale green. Or actually, let's set it to orange. So we're creating an all-day event, and we'll create it 2 days from now. So run, create, and there we created our orange event with the same title. And of course, as we saw, we can update the properties as we need to. So this is creating an all-day event. We can also create an all-day event for multiple days. So that will create multiple days. So we can have a start day and an end day for the events. So let's create some of those. And we'll call it event number 2. So this is going to be creating all-day event, and we're going to be having a start and an end date. So this is just one big event, big event week. So this is for going to be for the entire week, and let's set this so it can take in 2 different parameters. So it can take in the start date. So today will be the start date, and then the future date. So we'll set it to be 7 days from now, and that's going to be the future date. So that's going to be the end date of this one giant event that we've just created. So that's actually misspelt, const. And also for the event 2, let's set a description. And we'll just write, wow, that was a long event. So let's run that and see what happens. So now we're creating 2 events. And there's our big long event. So starting out today, it's running for 7 days or whatever amount of time that we're specifying it to run. So we're setting the time in the future, and then that's running for 1 week ahead. So that's how we can make the events. We can also add people to the event. So now creating quite a few events here. So let me comment out some of these events that I've just created, and we'll use the same times. So for the event as well, you can create an all-day event, and you can have options for the event. So let's add in some options, create an object that's going to contain those options. And this is another way that you can add some more details about your event. So we'll just call it opts and give it a value. So this is going to be an object that's going to contain some options. So you can have a location as an object within the objects, and this is going to be my home. I'll just uppercase that. And then you can also add in guests as well within the object. So if we want to send to a guest And I've got another email address that I can send to. So another testing email Gmail address. So let's add this person as my guest within the description. And I'll just call it the party. And do we want to send invites? So let's set the send invites. And this is expecting a Boolean value, so set it to true. So let's create the event. So now that we've got the options, and as you can see, these options correspond with what we can set. So here we're setting description, and here we're doing it all as kind of one chunk within the options. So whatever is easier, and I'm also going to just use the same dates. So how about we set it 4 days from now, and let's create our event. So we'll call it event 3, and use the calendar, create all day event. And this time we're going to enter in all the parameters. So we've got a start date, an end date, and all of the options for it. So let's set that up and give it a title, party, and then for the start date, we'll use the future date, and then also the future date for the end date. And then also for the options, we'll list out the options object. And within the logger log, let's log out that event number 3. And we'll see what gets created. So let's double check the code and run it. So it should be creating, it's actually, I need to have a future date that's past the start date. So let's update this slightly, and we'll create another date object. As what's happened here is the reason it threw an error is because we can't have the future date. We can't have the end date the same as the start date. So there has to be some type of way to distinguish the two. So let's get today's date and get the time. And because these are all day events, we need to add at least one day to it for the end date. So let's go ahead and add the end date. So we've got 1 day in between them. Otherwise, we're going to get a conflict there that we need to have at least 1 day. You can't. You have to have more than 24 hours between the two calculations. So let's go ahead and run the code and add the new event to the calendar. So now we should have a new event. Then there's the event that just showed up. And selecting the event, let's see what we've added in. So it's an all-day event. So this is the date. So it's the 1 day event. And we didn't send any of the additional, we'd have the description there. We also have who else we've invited to the event. So that's the guest that we've invited. And we sent out the notification to the guests that were invited on the event. So that's how you can set the all-day events. And coming up, we'll do a part 2 to creating events within the calendar. As you can see, there's a number of ways to create events. So let's copy this object the function that we used in the last lesson, and we'll create another one with similar, because we're going to need the similar parameters. And I'll just give this one a name of make events 2, so that to avoid any confusion from the previous one. So a lot of this stuff I can get rid of, creating that. We do need the dates that we need to set. We can keep some of these options as well, so that's also an opportunity to add those in. So let's keep all of this stuff, and then as well as the calculations for the future dates. And let's go ahead and create an event. So we saw how we can create all-day events. So this predominantly, last lesson we spent creating all-day events. So those are events that are checked off, and they're marked as creating and being all day. So they can have a start time, they can just be created with just a description, and so on. So in this one, we're going to be creating just a regular event. So let's use the calendar and create event. So there's just creating a regular event. there's a few options for this one as well. So we can specify title, start time, end time, and then also we can do one with the options. So creating that event object, and let's create we'll give it a name of event 1, and then we'll call the other one event 2. So just as we did in the last lesson. So creating the event, we need to have a start time as well as an end time. So let's start future date, end date. So it does require those two parameters. And then it does require a title as well. So actually the first one should be a title. And I'll just call it my next test. So this is starting date, future date. And for this one, we don't have to be 24 hours apart. So we can have just a few hours apart. So instead of, we'll just multiply it by 4, and then we can subtract from this calculation. And if we want to subtract, let's say we want to subtract 6 hours, we'll do the breakdown of the seconds, milliseconds, and 6 hours. Or if we want to add 6 hours ahead, we can do it that way. So the end time is going to be 6 hours ahead of the start time calculation. And we're going to create an event and then take the event 1. Let's set the color as well for this. And this is expecting a string value, so let's give it a color. Not sure which color that ends up to be. So this is just to see the event. So let's run it, and make events 2 is the one that we want to run. So it's creating another event in our calendar. And it just created the event there. So created the event and the start time and then the end time. So it's 6 hours ahead of whatever the current time is that we've set. So start time, end time, we've also set a color to it as well. So the color, I believe, was green or something that we've set to it. So let's go back, and we've set that color. We've created the event, future, and start time. So we didn't add any of the parameters. So that's another option when you are creating the event. You can create an event adding the options. So create one more event with the options, and give this one event 2, and give this one with options, and I'll give this one a new title, and then future and end date, and let's also include the options. That looks good. And then let's say we did forget to add a guest. So we want to add a guest, and in order to add the guest, we can set the string value of the email. So going in, and this is our guest we're going to add to that event. And I'll give this one just a way to distinguish between the two emails. So that's going to add the guest to the event as well. So let's run that one more time, and I'm gonna update this to be just 2 days ahead. Save, run, and let's see what we've got now within the calendar. So when we refresh the calendar, we can see that we've added in some more events. So we've got the 6 p.m. with options, 6 p.m. my next test. So that one came out green, and it's got the starting time for 6 p.m. So this is going to be a 6-hour event. And then the other one with the options is where we've added in the 2 guests. So there's the 2 guests that we added in. And we're going to do one more option, and we have the ability to create events series. So these are those repeating events. So if you select and if you repeat the event, this is the options. So you're creating a series of events that are going to be repeating. So let's create another function. And then within this function, we're going to create some repeating events. And the options and the parameters for them are fairly similar to what we just saw when we're creating the events. So we do need a start and an end, and we have an option to include the options as well. So creating the event series is going to still create the event object, but this event is going to be repeating. So creating the event object using the calendar, and let's create the event series. So that's the last one there that we've got the option for creating the event series. And then within the create event series, there's a number of parameters that you can enter in. So you can have the event series where you've got the title, start date, and then the reoccurrence. So setting up the calendar app and the reoccurrence, there's a number of different options for the reoccurrence. So let's set this one, and this is going to be the title, weekly meet, and we'll try to set this up for weekly. So when is the start date on that? So let's set that up for today. And then now we need to specify the occurrence. So it does require the one more parameter. That's going to be the occurrence. And we can get that from the calendar app class. And then select the new reoccurrence. And this is going to be an object, so a method, and it's going to have a number of different reoccurrence options. So let's just select that. And from the reoccurrence, we can set it up to daily exclusion, daily rule, add date, monthly, weekly exclusion, weekly rule. So there's all kinds of different options here that we can set it up. So let's do a weekly exclusion for the occurrence and save it. So this is going to be contained within the event occurrence class. So what the weekly exclusion is, it's going to add a rule that excludes occurrences on a weekly basis. If we add weekly rule, that's going to be the one that causes the event to reoccur on a weekly basis. So this is not on a weekly basis, and we do want to add in the weekly rule. So that's going to give us a weekly reoccurrence of the event. And this one did get fairly long, so let's set this as a value. So for the reoccurrence, so calendar app, and get the new reoccurrence. And then from here, we're going to add the weekly rule. So we'll get it as an object, REC, and then we can set that object over here. And that's going to create a neater format here for our event. And if we're creating an all-day event series, then we can get away with just having the 3 parameters. So that will work. So in this case, we can set just the title, the start, and then the reoccurrence. But we also, if we want to take, let's set event number 2, event series, then we do need the 4 parameters. So we need the title, and when it starts, when it ends. And this is for the event itself, so when it's going to start and when it's going to end. So we got to make sure that the dates correspond on the same day. And then also let's add in the reoccurrence value. So that way we can set a reoccurrence that's going to reoccur on a weekly basis using the event series. And then there's also another option within here where you can add in the options. So we've got all of the options there. So taking the create event series, and let's add in the 4th parameter, which is going to be the options. So we've got the reoccurrence that we're setting. And if you want to add to the reoccurrence, there's an event reoccurrence class, and then you can just do the drop down and select to run till a certain date as well. So these are setting up the events, and they're going to be reoccurring on a weekly basis. And let's add in the last one where we've got the options. So now we've populated our calendar with a whole bunch of events. So let's run that, and we should have a number of events that we're creating. And now when we go back to our calendar, we've got a bunch of these weekly events that are running. Oops, so looking at this, it looks like we might have had some errors there within our weekly series. So it's actually logged the weekly series, so it's got a number of days that it's running every week. So it looks like it's running quite often and way too often. So we did have an error within the code. So let's check that and update that. And select these out, and we can delete these, all the events. And again, delete, so clean up the calendar, so this event and all the events. And these actually should have been the start times and end times. So instead of the end date, we should have used the future date and the end date. So let's do a quick update on these. I know we're cluttering quite a bit of what we've got here. So that should be future date, and let's do a quick fix on this. So it should be end date. So the end date is not when the reoccurrence is going to end. It's going to be the end whenever the event ends. And let's make them 2-hour events for the end time. And let's update this because it's running weekly. So we need to update the future and the end time. Let's run this one more time. So we did have some issues with the times that we were setting, and this time it looked like it created them properly, where we've got it set to be weekly. And then we've got our other weekly meet that are all day events. So when they're all day events, they're going to show up as solid on your calendar. And they've created them with a starting. And if you do want to set an end, you can set the end when you're setting your rule here for the event reoccurrence. And that's available within the event reoccurrence class. So you can find out more information available there. So you can set some more parameters there when you can have it until as well. So you can set a date that's going to run until. So there's a number of options there within the dropdown that you can set the reoccurrence to within your events. Hey, we've created a bunch of events on our calendar, so I want to run through and delete some of those and clean up our calendar. So let's create a function, and this will just be called delete events, and we'll loop through, so del events. So first, let's get our calendar object, and that's the default calendar where we've got all of this content in. And once we've got the default calendar, then we can loop through and we can get all of the events. So let's get our events object, and using the calendar object, we want to get events. So we want to get the events, and we want to set the parameters of the events that we're getting. So for the get events, you can specify a start and an end time for the event that you want to get. So let's create that, and starting out with today. So that's going to be our start date for getting the events, and then end date. And let's set a new date using the today and get time. And then we'll take that value from today get time and multiply that. And let's set how far ahead we want to go. So setting up, and we'll do the calculation for 1 day, and then we'll multiply it. So we'll have a value there for the day, how many minutes, how many milliseconds, and so on we have for the day, and then we can multiply it by how many days ahead we want to go. So let's start with 1,000 milliseconds, 1,000, and for every second, so there's 60 seconds in a second, and then within a minute, so there's 60 minutes in an hour, 24 hours within a day. So this calculation is going to return back how many days. So we want to take the number of days, and let's multiply it by, if we want to go a full year ahead, we can do 365 days. So taking the days object, and it should actually be day, and taking the day value, and we'll multiply it by 365, and that will return back how many days ahead we want. So within the calendar, let's set, using the date objects that we just created, we're setting a start, and also we'll set an end date value and return back all of the events that are contained in there. So let's loop through, and before we do that, within the logger log, let's check how many events that we have. So take the events, and we'll return back a length value for the events. So let's delete, run the function, and it looks like our event start time must be before the end time. So let's see what happened here. And it actually should be plus. So let me update that and try that one more time. So we've got 273 separate events within over the next year. So let's see how many we have over the next 30 days. So update the value for day. So we've got 33 over the next 30 days. So how about we loop through all of those events, and we can remove out those events. So take the events, and using the for each, we're looping through the events. And then within the logger log, now we're looking at the event object. So it's going to be the calendar event. And then of course we saw that there's a number of methods that we can apply. So taking the event, you can delete the event. You can delete a tag on the event. And then also there's all those update options that we had as well, and also getting the information from that event. So the one that we want is we want to delete the event entirely. So we're running the method on the event to delete the event. So let's run that and delete some of the events. So we've got 33 events, and as we're looping through, we're outputting the event information. We probably should have put the name, but we can do that for the rest of the calendar year. So now as we loop through, it's deleting the events from the current calendar for over the next 30 days. And as you can see, it's cleared out my calendar for the next 30 days using the app script. So only if it was that easy in real life. So now let's run the function again, and we shouldn't have any events in there. So we're back to 0. So if we want to clear out the calendar for the next 365 days, let's set that and run and clear out the calendar. So we've got 240, so this could take a while, and it's going to take the calendar event. And you could also do quite a bit of stuff with the calendar event object, and as we saw, there's a number of different methods that are attached to that. So as it's running through and it's executing and removing them, so that's how you can loop through and select events and delete events. So go ahead and try it out, and make sure that if you do have a calendar that you want to practice this, you shouldn't be using your default calendar if it's an email that you're using every day, and especially when you're deleting and removing events. So just keep that in mind as you're practicing with the code. Hey, in this lesson, we're going to create an event and then add some guests to the event, and then return back the information, and we're going to be able to see what information is contained within the guests. So let's create a function and add my event to the calendar. And we start out by, just as always, we select the calendar app service, and let's get the default calendar. And then within the calendar object, and actually we're going to create an object for the event so we can make some updates to it. So doing a create event value, and within the create event, test my event. And for what date do we want to set it? So the start time and an end time. So let's construct those as well. So today, and using the JavaScript date, and then also let's do the start. And so generating a new date object and using the today get time method, returning it back within milliseconds. So it's returned back as a time string value. And where do we want to set the start? So multiplying out the milliseconds, the seconds, the minutes, the hours, in order to turn back a day. And then let's say we want to put it 3 days ahead. So that will be our start date. So let's set up another variable. And I'll just call it my day. So that way, whenever we're doing the start and the end date, that we're ensuring that we've got the start and an end date for the same. So what we're going to be doing is we're just going to be adding to it. So let's take the my day value, and then we're going to add to my day. And this actually shouldn't be multiplying, it should be adding. So we can take the my day value, and then here we're going to do the calculations. So let's start it out and set the my day and how many hours we want to put it. and then the end date will be a larger increment for the hours. So we just add this together to our total value that we're trying to create. So start, and now let's create an end time using the same formula that we used for start and creating an end value. And we just need to make sure that the end, as we've seen a few times that we've got the errors as we're writing the code, we want to make sure that the end is larger than the start. So start, end, and that's it. So we'll create that event. And then for the event object, let's add guest. And we're going to be adding the guests using their email address. So just a string value for their email address. And just a Gmail there, and I'm going to add +1 to it. So it's actually going to be my default email address, but when you add the plus, it's treated as a separate, different email address. So let's do +3. So we'll add 3 guests to that event. And now let's run it and add the event to the calendar. So there's my test event. And if I open it up, I've got my 3 guests that are sitting there. So they've got all of their email addresses there. You can see that within the event. So now if we want to loop through and we wanted to get some of the guest information, and we'll create a function that will list out the guests from the event. So we want to retrieve back the event. We can find it by name. So let's create the event object, or actually create the calendar object and the default calendar. So I can copy and paste what we did before earlier, and then using the calendar object, let's get the event. And probably the easiest one is going to be to get events for day. So we want to return back all of the events on a particular day. So it's expecting a date object. So let's select the event. So just use that start. And this is going to be the start date that we'll look for. So within the start, it will return back whatever the events are for that day. And this is actually going to be plural, so it's returning back multiple events. So within the logger log, let's see what we've got for events. And of course, we can list out the length, and we're going to be looping through all the events. So it's returning out a block of events. And it doesn't look like it picked up the events. Let's add to the, and I didn't have a value for my day, that's why it didn't pick that up. So let's set up a variable value for my day, and we'll run it one more time. And we're actually running the add to my date, so let's run the my guests. And today is not defined. So let's define the today as well, and try to run that one more time. So we got 3 different calendar event objects. That's because I ended up running the add my event 3 times. So now I've got 3 of the identical events, and we can look through those events. And if we take a look at those events themselves, they each should have 3 guests. So 3 events, 3 guests, and we want to get some more information on the guests within the events. So let's take the events object, and we want to get to the calendar event class. So looping through till we get to the calendar event class, and then that's where we can actually get the user information. So within the event object, and let's create a variable guests. And for the event object, we've got an option to get guest list. And let's log out the value of guests. And that actually should be plural. So we don't need to log out the events anymore. So let's see what we've got for my guests. Run the function. And so we've got all 3 guests, and they're coming back with an array. And we can see that the class is the event guest class. And so from this class, we can get email, we can get the guest status, and we can get the name. And we can also get a value for the number of additional guests that there are, excluding that selected guest. So let's set up an object for the person, and then we'll log out the person value. So within the object, we can return back the email of the guest. So let's select the guests, and this is actually going to be an array that we need to loop through. So guests, and for each one. And for each one, we're going to return back a value for a guest. Hopefully we haven't used that before. And then for each one of the guests, we'll log out and we'll create an object for a person. And each one of those guests, we can get the email using the get email method. There's also the status using the get guest status, and there's also get status. So guest status returns back the status of the guest of the event, and it returns back a class for a guest status. So let's list them both so we can see the difference. And this is just going to return back the guest status. And also we're going to get, we've got the email, let's also get the name of the guest. So using the guest object and then get name. And also, how about we also get the get additional guests. So for additional guests, using the guest object, and that's going to be the last option that we have there. So once we've got it within an object, let's use the logger log and log out the details of this guest. So let's run my guests and see what happens. So as you can see, so we've got the status as invited, we've got the email address, we've got the additional guests, so there's 0.0. The status is invited. So this is the guest status is using the guest status type. So that guest status types, you can have the invited, maybe, no owner, yes. So those are the 5 different status types. And if you just want to get the status by itself, then this is just returning back whatever the guest status is. So you do really have just the 2 options there. And as we're looping through, you can get a better sense for the information that you can return back about the guests. So that's how we can see what guests are invited. And of course, we've already seen how to add guests. If we want to remove guests, we can remove guests from the event itself. So as we loop through the events, we've got a guest list there of all of the guests. So let's take the event object and do a remove of a guest. And what is the value here that we want to remove? So we can use the email address as a value to remove the guest. So let's set remove email, and I'll just set it to be blank. And then we'll assign a value of the guest email as we loop through the guests. So that way we're picking up the guest's email and getting the email address as a string value, and that's going to be on the parent of the guests object. So accessing that variable, and that will allow us to remove the guest. So let's see what happens. So hopefully now as we're running through, we're removing the guests. Let's run it one more time, and let's see within the calendar entries where we're at. So when we go to edit, we've removed out the 1 guest already, and we've removed out a 2nd guest, and then as we run it, we're going to remove out the 3rd guest as well. So it's just removing out that 1st guest as it's looping through, because this is going to be an array of 3, so it's just taking and it's just saving whatever the last email was. So that's why we're only removing out 1, even though that we're listing out the 3 guests. So it allows us to remove out 1 at a time. If we wanted to remove out all of the guests immediately, we could move this up one level and keep it within the loop where we're listing out each one of the guests. And then that would remove out the guest as we iterated through the list of guests. So that would have removed out all of the guests at one time. In this lesson, we're going to be generating a mini application that's going to generate a spreadsheet and then go through all of our calendar entries on a given start and end date and list all of that information in the newly created spreadsheet. So this is all going to be done with the script. In addition, we're also going to be adding in some random calendar entries to populate our calendar with some new data. So let's give you an example and run the make a sheet. So what that is going to do, that's going to run the application. It's going to generate the new spreadsheet. And within the new spreadsheet, we're going to list out all of the calendar entries. And this is all generated and you can see it's still being populated right now as the script is running. So that's the application we're building. Let's get to it. So let's go into the drive. And we're actually going to generate the spreadsheet on the fly directly from the standalone script. And we're just going to place it within the root folder of our drive. So let's begin, and we'll create a function, make a sheet function. And within the make a sheet function, we're going to list out all of our calendar entries that we have. So we need to also add some calendar entries. So we're going to randomly add random calendar entries or calendar events. So we want to generate some random ones within the calendar so that we have something that we can see and we can look at. So within the calendar, so let's first use the calendar app and get the default calendar. And within the default calendar, we want to loop through and generate some random calendar dates. So let's create that, where we'll create a start date. And this is going to be all done randomly. So creating a for loop where we're starting at 0 and we'll loop through while I is less than 25, increment I plus 1. And then we'll loop through. So we need to generate some dates, and we can use the start date for today. So doing a new date object. And what this will do is this will create a new date object, and then within here we can use that date object and create a date object with that start of today date. So using today and then get time. And let's also do the calculation for 1 day. So we've got 1000 milliseconds, 60 seconds, 60 minutes, 24 hours in the day. So we've got the day value, and let's do a random day. So we're going to multiply this using math floor. And then using math random, this is just regular JavaScript. So multiply it by what we have for, let's list them out for within the next 30 days. And we'll take the day and take the random day value, and we're going to multiply it by the value of day. So that should give us a random start date over the next 30 days that we can generate some of our calendar entries. So let's create some events. So creating an event. So using the calendar object, create event. So within the event, let's give it a title. And also we'll set this as well. And give it a value and concatenate the value of I to that so that we have different titles for each one. So this is also going to be randomly generated. So title, and we need to have the start date. So that will be the start. And I'm going to actually create this as an all day event. So it's a little bit simpler where we just create a all day event. And then within the all day event, we can just do a title and a start because it's just contained within the one date. So that should generate some random events for us. So let's run the function, add random calendar entries. Let's go back to the calendar. So over the next month, we've got a bunch of random events that have been added into the calendar. Let's do a quick refresh. And there's all of our random events. So now we've populated and we've got a whole bunch of stuff happening over the next 30 days. And you can run this type of function as you're testing out the application and just get more comfortable with what you can produce. So what we want to do is we want to make a sheet with the dates, and we want to just generate this sheet on the drive. So let's create that. And we'll create the spreadsheet. So using the spreadsheet app, we're going to use create to create a sheet. So we need a name for the sheet. And I'll just call it new cals. So creating a brand new sheet object. And then within the spreadsheet object, we want to add a new sheet. So it will already have a default sheet, so it'll have the first sheet by default. But let's go ahead and we're going to insert a sheet anyway. And this can be the sheet that we'll use to write the content to. So let's identify it with a variable name of sheet. So insert a new sheet. And then for the sheet, let's set a name for the sheet. Now let's call it cals. So we don't have to check if the sheet already exists because this is just a brand new sheet that we're creating. So it's creating a brand new sheet, setting the names. And now let's create our loop. So actually first, before we do that, let's append a row. And this is going to be the top row of data that we're going to be appending to the spreadsheet. So what do we want to track in here? So maybe we want to track the event day. We also want to do the event ID and the event title and the event description if it has, and so on. So we can track all of that typical event object information. So we're going to just stick to those 4. So now let's select the calendar object using the calendar app. We're going to get the default calendar, and we want to get all of the events. So getting the calendar object, get the events, and we need to set a start and an end for the events. So start and an end time for the events. So we did set the start for the current time. So let's use that same format. So it's going to be all of the events within the next 30 days. So let's set up a start. And the start time is going to be a new date. And we're going to use the today. Get time from it. And also I'm going to include the day calculation, so I don't have to do that again. So it makes it a lot simpler when you've already done the math for this. So get the time, and we're going to actually start it on whatever the current date is. So the today date. So this is actually going to be an end value. So we're taking the day and we're going to multiply the day by 30. So we're starting on today, and then we've got our end date to get all of the calendar events. And log, let's see how many events we're looking at. So get a length back for those events. And also, usually I do like to just run the script every now and then just to make sure that everything's working. And I know we're going to be creating multiple sheets. You can also have one spreadsheet and then create different names for the sheets as you're inserting the sheets. So that's another option as well. So let's run it. And actually, I've just added in. So let me cancel that, and I selected the wrong function. So let's run make a sheet, and we're going to have to accept permissions because we're accessing the spreadsheet app class. So that's new, and that's why we're being asked for permissions again. So there's that where we're updating the Google Drive with the content that we're generating from the calendar. So it looks like we found 28 events. That sounds about right. So let's take the events and use for each and get the event object. And then as we loop through the event object, this is where we can append to the row. So we can create a basic array and then add that array value. So let's create an array. So just a regular blank array. And this can also be a const as well, as we're not going to be reassigning array to anything. We're just going to be adding to the array. So as we loop through, we've got the event information. So we can get the date value. So let's select the array and then push to the array. And within the push, let's get the date value. And we do have a few options for getting the day. So we can get the start time or we can get the end time. So in this case, we'll get the start time. And actually, maybe we need to do a start time and then an end time, because those are the values that we are able to pick up. So let's update this to start time and end time, because even if the event is all day, it's going to have the start time and the end time. So the end time will be the end of the day. So get end time using the end time method. So we're just pushing into the array all of this event information. So let's get the ID of the event and array push. And let's use the event get title of the event. And then array push using the event object, and we need to get the description. So let's get description of the event. So once we've generated that, we can push that into we can actually just append it to the new row. So take the sheet object and append to the row the array. And that should generate a brand new spreadsheet with some of our data from the calendar. So let's run make a sheet. And we've got the 28 items there that we've got the list of. And it looks like it completed. So let's see what was generated. So this is the newly generated spreadsheet. And let's open it up and check to see the sheet and what data we've got within the calendar sheet. So within here, we listed out the start time, end time, ID, title, and because they didn't have descriptions, that's why it's blank. Nothing was listed in there. So that's how you can generate and get the contents of your calendar and add it into your spreadsheet.